All right, so here we go. Today's talk is a Freakonomic take on open standards and Jakarta EE. So this is not a technical talk, but it's actually one of the talks that's really, truly near and dear to my heart. I believe this is actually, if there's one talk I could give, this is a talk that I believe I can uniquely provide the most amount of value. So this is not a talk about how you can use the technology in your day job or how to use a specific aspect of it. But rather, this is a talk more holistically about this technology from a different perspective. In this particular case, a Freakonomic perspective. And I'll explain in a second why that is. But in short, I'm really glad that the Eclipse Foundation and the Tech Talk series decided to have this talk and saw value in it. So that other funny word in the title, Freakonomics, what is that about? So this goes back a little bit to my own background. So to give you a bit of background on me, I didn't actually start in this field as a computer scientist. I started in this field back in my freshman year as an economist. So computer science was a sort of a side hobby of mine at that point in time. And I still do retain a interest in economics. Certainly, I listen to these two authors. This is an old book. It's a New York Times bestseller by now, and the authors actually have a podcast. It's a very interesting podcast. I'll tell you a little bit about the book and what this book is about if you don't know what it is. But basically, what this book is about and what these authors are about is the fact that economics is actually not all about dollars and cents. It's not all about macroeconomic GDP and inflation rates and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, economics is actually about understanding human behavior and what motivates people and what motivates markets, and taking an analytical and data-driven approach to understanding the world. So this book in Freakonomics, it takes a look at many different aspects that you wouldn't think of. So things like abortion and population rates, and things like drug dealers, why some people decide to be drug dealers, what is the effect of naming a child a certain way, and can that predict their future, and so on. So it's a very interesting book. And what this book, when I read it, made me realize is that I'm actually looking at our particular field, server-side Java, through Freakonomic eyes. And this is really the fundamental reason why I am involved in things like Java EE and Jakarta EE. And I thought, after this realization, I need to share this realization with whoever I can, because even if they're not an economist, they may understand why I'm looking at these things the way I am, and it's perhaps important for them to realize this as well. So that's a bit about Freakonomics and what this talk is about. It's about taking a look at open standards and Jakarta EE from an economic standpoint, in short, a analytical market space standpoint. So believe it or not, standards are everywhere, right? So it's not just about us in terms of programming and technology. We tend to be very, very heavily driven by standards. So wherever you look, there's always a standard behind it. But in fact, even if you look at your day-to-day job or day-to-day life, what you'll realize very quickly is behind almost everything in the modern world, there is a standard behind it. Everything that's manufactured, everything that you use is usually backed by some kind of standards and some kind of standards body. So there's a reason why this is, and this is why, fundamentally, why standards are important for us in the Java world as well. And in particular, from an economic standpoint, there's one particular reason that is the most important one, and that is the one that we will focus a little bit of our time understanding today. But let's take a look at the reasons from a holistic standpoint, just so we all are sort of on the same page before we take our journey into understanding our Jakarta EE and open standards from an economic standpoint. So the first is interoperability. Standards give us interoperability, meaning that if there's a producer and a manufacturer of two different things, they can't always meet on a one-to-one basis to agree upon how their two things can work together with each other. So the best way of guaranteeing this is having an interoperability standard to say, hey, this is given a type of producer and supplier, this is how they interact with each other. And that applies to software as well. In order to work for 2 bits of software to work with each other, you need standards. Standards are good for portability and compatibility. So this is more along the lines of somebody that needs to depend on something else. In our terms, let's say we're application developers, and we depend on something to run our application on. So what standards allow you to do in this case, it gives you a base minimum set of things that you can rely upon. And the end result is that you can move your thing from one place to the other. That's what compatibility and portability at the end of the day gives you. Application servers are a very good example of that. You can basically make some small changes to your application, but be able to move from one application server to one vendor to another. Standards provide a baseline quality of service, right? So if nobody guarantees what the quality of service is, you won't know what you can depend on. This is especially important for things like food safety, transportation safety. You need those types of standards to be in place for those reasons. Standards provide a stable core for broad ecosystems. So when you have something that is very, very important, that a bunch of people rely upon, you need that thing to be predictable and well understood. Right? So if that thing is, let's say, controlled by a monopoly or defined in a proprietary fashion, that's a very high-risk ecosystem, because if anything changes in that thing that so many people depend upon, well, guess what? We're all going to be negatively impacted by those changes. So that's why another reason why you need open standards to define that stable core, reliable core for a very, very broad ecosystem. You need to maximize vendor and implementation neutrality, minimize lock-in risks. So if you're a business person, you will well understand this, right? So if you're spending a whole bunch of money on a vendor, you don't want to be so tied to that vendor that if something happens to that vendor, or if that vendor decides to be not so good, there's no way for you to get out of it, right? So the standards provides you that vendor neutrality and a risk mitigation from lock-in. And standards reduce unnecessary fragmentation, right? So this is an interesting, you can also have an entire talk on this particular topic, but there's a question of when is choices too many, right? So there is a point in time where there's a point of diminishing returns of having too many choices. Too many choices simply just add to hyper competition and noise rather than actual customer value. So there is a point in time, especially for things that are very commonplace, very, very foundational, that you don't actually want that much choice. You just want to know, okay, this is a thing I want to use and I want to go with it. And that's where open standards come into play as well. And we'll talk more about this. This is a point that's correlated with the healthy competitive ecosystems point as well. So in some cases, as a consumer, you actually want to deliberately limit your set of choices to a set of things that are standards and interoperable and supported by multiple parties. And finally, this is a point that we'll talk about a bit more in depth today. Majority of this talk is going to be dedicated to exploring this topic. Standards play an important role in maintaining healthy competitive ecosystems under certain circumstances. There are certain circumstances where really without standards, you wind up with a very, very bad market outcome. And that's what we're going to talk about. And that's the idea that we'll explore more about today. And that's the fundamental reason why things like open standards and specifically Jakarta EE is so important to us. Okay, so some of you might be surprised about the fact that that I'm talking about this topic at all. And you might be wondering, is this something I'm making up? Well, I'm not, right? So the reality is this is standards, and the reason for standardization is actually well established in the economics domain. A lot of economists spend their life things that I found very curious years ago is that the ISO. ISO, I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's an international standards organization. It's one of the it's like the UN. It's a multinational organization that plays a very important part in our world. It actually has to do with things like food safety and transportation safety. And they've actually bothered documenting, and they sponsor economists to study this very topic that we'll talk about today. So if you have a bit of time, take a look at these resources. Some of them might seem a little bit, let's say, obscure to you if you don't have an economic background, but it might also be interesting to take a look at this, just to understand that we don't operate in a vacuum. So we're interconnected with a whole bunch of things that are not necessarily about writing code. All right, so in order to understand any of this, there's a simple concept that you actually need to understand. This is a simple concept that I found fascinating in my undergraduate years. This has been around. This is a theory that's been around for a long time. It's been around essentially since the 1930s, right after the Depression. People got to understand this interesting phenomena, and it allows us to sort of understand our world a bit better. So this is something called the network effect. So let's spend a little bit of time understanding this network effect. So as you can see on my screen here, I have a picture of a bunch of telephones. So you can understand where this theory actually comes from. It comes directly from, believe it or not, the inventor, okay, of telephones, some guy that actually lived very close to where I live today. And this is where the observation came from. So let's assume that you have these three different phone networks. Okay, so one phone network is something that you and your brother-in-law came up with, and you have a line from his house to yours, and you guys can call each other. But that's about it. That's what limits your network. Okay. Let's say there's a slightly bigger network. Let's say a network of farmers that decided to put up their own poles and ran phone lines from their house to another. And there's these five families that can call each other, and that's it. That's their phone network. And now let's imagine a much bigger one, a much bigger telephone network, maybe managed by the town or managed by the city. Right. So if you are a new guy coming in and you are evaluating these three networks, which one would you pick? Obviously, you would pick the one that gives you the most value, and it's the most useful one to join, especially if you're paying some money to be part of this network. So you would pick the biggest network. But once you take this argument to its logical extreme, what you realize is that what this means is that this is tending towards monopoly power. So the bigger your market share, the more likely you will succeed in this scenario. If you have a bigger company and a smaller company, eventually the bigger company will get more and more business, and the smaller company will get smaller and smaller business and eventually go away because they won't necessarily be competitive anymore. So this is a situation where this is a natural monopoly. The dynamics of the market, the dynamics of the thing that you are dealing with lends itself to becoming a monopoly. So telephones, a telephone network is very, very prone to this, and something like this, something that depends that more value is added by one more person adopting the thing, right? If this dynamic exists, and it exists very much in software, things like infrastructure software in particular, you have this thing called network effect. So when you have network effect, what happens is there's two different market outcomes. There's only two things that can happen once you have recognized that the thing that you are dealing with has this tendency of having a network effect. You can either wind up with a de facto standard, or you can wind up with an open standard. Now, if you don't know what these words mean, they may seem relatively harmless. Okay, yeah, they're both standards, and standards are a good thing. The only different word here is de facto versus open. Well, what's the big deal, right? As long as I have a standard, isn't it the same thing? Well, it's really not. And this is where our friends at ISO really help us out, and they do a body of work to understand what the difference between a de facto standard and what's called a de-jure standard. So de-jure or open standards or standards via fiat. These are the same things. They're basically open standards. Is really all about. So in fact, this is a deck. This is a slide deck within a slide deck. This is a deck that is part of a workshop, training workshop run by the ISO, where it explains what the difference between a de facto standard is and a de jure standard is. So a de facto standard reflects a market situation. So this is a situation where there is a network effect in place, and the network effect has gone on for such a long period of time that there is just one thing that defines that market. If you want to use that particular functionality, you want to use that bit of infrastructure, there is really only one player that you would seriously consider. So that is what a de facto standard really is. It's a de facto, meaning those are the facts of the market. Right? It's not anything that anyone can engineer. It just happens by way of marketplace evolution, especially when you have these network effects in place. The good features about them is, yes, they do provide standards. So they provide some of the benefits that we talked about for the reasons for having standards. Obviously, the big one that it does not provide at all is this healthy marketplace situation. In the end, what happens is there's just one dominant player, and they control that market. It's effectively a monopoly. At the end of the day, we'll talk a little bit more in subsequent slides as to why monopoly-like situations are so worrisome. Why should we treat it with a great deal of concern? But the main ones are lack of transparency. The decisions are not necessarily driven by customers. They're driven by the interests of the monopoly rather than the interest of the consumer. And by virtue of the monopoly, the monopolist can do various things that ultimately goes down to limiting information, limiting market flexibility. Now, de jure standards, on the other hand, is the opposite. So this is where the market basically recognizes that there is a network effect. And the way to counteract this network effect is for all people to agree on not producing the same thing, but producing things that basically conform to an agreed upon level of service. So to a consumer, for all intents and purposes, it looks very much the same, okay? But in fact, these are different things. These are different implementations, different products that come from different providers. What the heart of open standards is this word transparency. And we'll talk more about in this slide, the words that are highlighted: transparency, openness, and consensus. We'll talk more about these. These are very important concepts in understanding the value of Jakarta EE and understanding the value of open standards. But the heart of any open standards is actually due process, right? You need to have a well-documented process that everybody can participate in an open way. All the decisions and all of the relevant information need to be transparent, right? So that both the suppliers and the consumers can participate in the process in a transparent fashion. You need to have openness. Anyone that wishes to join should be able to join this, even if it's a consumer, a new producer, what have you. And you need to have consensus, right? That's the heart of it. You have to agree upon the thing that you are going to all produce and consume. So consensus is very, very important. Now, consensus is a funny word. It's been coming up a little bit. I'm seeing it a little bit, a misunderstanding of this term, especially in some of the Jakarta EE ecosystem conversations. Consensus does not mean that we all agree, and it's just a nirvana where we're all friends and we love each other and we all say yes to each other's propositions. It actually means quite the opposite. It means agreeing to disagree, right? Or another way to put this is disagree and commit. So it's the idea that because you are part of this ecosystem, because you are part of this market, you may have your own ideas, right? But you have to agree with the consensus process, right? And once whatever the consensus process is reached, you have two options. You can either exit the market, or you simply say, okay, I disagree, but I'm going to be part of this ecosystem anyway. So open standards, we'll talk more about this also, but some of the disadvantages are it can be longer, right? So if you're just a monopolist, you can just make whatever decision you like. It's very quick. Or if you're a near monopolist, same thing. It takes time to reach consensus. It takes time to document consensus. Of course, there's always a risk of somebody saying, hey, I'm not part of this, but I want to be part of this market, and sort of engage in disruptive behavior and try to become a de facto standard to replace an open standard. So these are the risks, well understood risks of open standards. By the way, Tanya, so I forgot to mention this. So I do definitely want this talk to be conversational. So if anyone has a question or concern or comment, they should feel free to express that right away, and feel free to just interrupt me right in the middle of the talk, and let's discuss that particular point instead of just moving forward. Are you still there?
Thanks, Sridhar. Yeah, absolutely. I'm still here.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully I'm not boring you to death.
Not at all.
Okay, very good. All right. All right. So there are actually some real world examples of this occurring. This is not just a construct. In fact, it's quite the opposite. After the Great Depression, economists actually came to understood these market dynamics, and came to figure out what the solutions to these problems actually are. So there's actually three different companies that are landmark cases where economists needed to figure out, okay, this is what's happening. How do we figure out what the solution is? And the solutions are open standards. So these examples are AT&T. Again, if you look it up, this is basically the canonical example of what happens when there's a network effect, and the network effect translates to a monopoly. And you'll look, if you're interested, you should look into the roots of where AT&T started and why AT&T was almost destined to become a monopoly from day one. Standard Oil Company is another example, and United States Steel. These are all another example. So the other thing you will notice is these are all American companies. Right? So there is something inherent about the American system and way of governing and way of thinking that makes it especially prone to network effect, and especially prone to monopolization, and why in the US actually open standards are the most important thing. Right? So why you have to especially be careful with the US markets dealing with open standards and not letting monopolies happen in the first place. And it has to do with the size of the market and a general ethos of laissez-faire, meaning, let it be, right? When you let it be, things don't always turn out the way you think. Okay. So what are the perils of monopoly power? Why should we be so concerned about this? Again, there's definitely a distinct way of thinking in Asia and Europe and versus the United States way of thinking. In Asia and Europe in particular, there are entire non-government organizations that understand these things, and they keep an eye to make sure these things don't happen. So the monopoly is another funny word, right? So when you express this word to a non-economist, they automatically think, oh, it must be just one company that dominates the market, and it's like impossible to get into that market. They begin thinking, imagining those old Western films where there is some thug that forcibly takes over all the ranches and owns everything, or the monopoly game. They think one person wins in the end and owns just everything. That's really not how monopoly power works in the real world. You don't actually have to own everything all the time. But what happens is you can own enough to control the market. Right? That is the biggest distinction between a healthy ecosystem and not, right? When there's a single vendor that actually can control everybody else's decisions, right? And they have enough market power to dictate their way or the highway, right? So when that happens, the losers are really the consumers, and the losers are also, at the end of the day, anybody new that wants to enter the market. But at the end of the day, really what it comes down to is it's a bad outcome for consumers. Okay, so when you have monopoly power, in the end, you get to determine a higher pricing, higher long-term pricing of something. You can also control predatory pricing, meaning that you can, at least temporarily, while you're establishing the monopoly, hold prices down below what it takes for you to manufacture it. And that basically will drive out all of the rest of the competition. Those that do not have monopoly power will be driven out of the market. There'll be fewer market choices in the end because not as many people will be able to enter a market with monopoly power. Usually there is also anti-competitive behaviors, right? So pricing behavior is one obvious one. There's many other kind of such behaviors as well that a monopolist can employ. For example, pressure on suppliers and pressure on consumers not to go away from them and not to consider any other competition. In the end, in the long term, this is unhealthy because it leads to less innovation, less choices, less quality of service, and a very high risk monoculture ecosystem. Even if this monopolist was a person holding monopoly power was very benevolent, right? If something were to change in that monopoly, basically it would put an entire ecosystem at risk, right? Because it becomes essentially a single point of failure. So that's something I think as computer scientists we understand. So we want to avoid single points of failure, and that's effectively what this high risk monoculture ecosystem becomes. So these are the things why we really need to pay attention when we see these scenarios, and we need to see what are the solutions. And of course, the solutions that most economists agree upon is when there is network effect is this open standard solution. So now let's dive into a little bit of what open standards really are. Right? So this is another funny word. Even if you did understand the distinction between de facto standards and open standards, what are open standards and what are the basically necessary preconditions to become for something to be an effective open standard? That's something a lot of people also don't understand, right? So if you don't have a true open standard, it's actually just as dangerous, maybe even more dangerous than a de facto standard. So there are some basic things that need to be in place for something to truly be an open standard. So an open standard, if you break down to it are really these few components, right? So it is the ability of corporations, which are essentially entities on their own, groups of people. So groups of people could be a set of users, a set of interested users. So often, if you study US corporate dynamics, a funny thing that happens is that a single individual shareholder doesn't actually have that much power. Right? So at the end of the day, power can reside in the corporate board of directors because every single shareholder is just they're doing their own little thing and their own little person, and there's not much they can do as an individual. But when these people band together and they come together, they can actually be probably the most powerful force in the market, right? So one of the participants of open standards could be groups of people that come together that have a common interest, that are not tied in any direct financial way, but usually these are groups of users, groups of end users, groups of consumers. And of course, an individual ought to also be able to participate on their own. In fact, back in the JCP, which I do consider an open standard, I still do, that's what I did for a number of years myself. I contributed just as an individual. I represented nobody. I represented simply myself, and I contributed to that open standard process. The second thing, and the most valuable thing, and the thing that defines it and differentiates it from a non-open standard is the process. And the process needs to be well understood, well documented, and non-discriminatory. Now, I'm not talking about racial discrimination or LGBT rights here. What this means is that all of these parties, a company, an individual, or a group of users, can freely participate without hindrance, and this is guaranteed by the process itself. Okay. Finally, there's a well understood set of artifacts, right? At the end of the day, the open standards need to produce something, and it needs to produce enough, right? So that the world can use it, right? So the output needs to be useful and repeatable. So any particular person should be able to take this output and produce something useful that can be used by this entire ecosystem, whoever it may be in the world. Okay. All right. So, like I said, the process is the biggest deal here. So this particular diagram, I think Tanya will be very familiar with this. This is actually the Eclipse Foundation specification process, the one that is being applied for Jakarta EE. But that's actually not the point, right? So the real point I wanted to give you is to show you how a process looks like. Okay. And what are the fundamentally key important points to having this sort of open standards? If you look at the JCP documentation, it has something very, very similar. If you look at, for example, OSI, it has a very similar process. These all look very similar, and they all have the same fundamental components. There's always a proposal. So anybody can propose an idea or propose a standard. There's always a review, and these are all independent. So if you look at the U.S. system, there's three branches of government, right? The executive branch, the legislative branch, and then the presidential, or rather the congressional branch, right? So these in an open standard are also different bodies, right? So when somebody is reviewing something, there's supposed to be an independent view of what's going on. It's not supposed to be all the same people. Right. So in each of these things and each of these steps, there's always an open review process, and anybody should be able to participate in this review. Especially as an end user, you ought to be able to participate in the review process. So you can review a proposal, you can review an execution plan, you can review the development process itself. The development process, hopefully these days, is agile. So there's going to be different milestones that are produced by anything that is developed under a standard. These things can also be reviewed in an incremental basis. Finally, there will be a version that is a big milestone, meaning a release. Okay, so that release ought to be reviewed as well, and then finally ratified and consumed to be put out there in the world as something that everybody can take a look at. And this is just the process. There's other parts of the picture as well in order for something to be counted as an open standard. But this is the heart of it. You need to have a well-documented, well-understood process that you have these basic components. And the most important component is a specific review process and a specific breakdown of when things occur, and things can't just move along without that word consensus, right? So you need informed consensus through this review process before something can become something. Otherwise, it's no different than a de facto standard. Somebody just creating something and putting it out there, whatever they feel like. So that's not the case. There has to be this part of it in it in order for it to be counted as an open standard. This, in general, is what an open standard produces, right? So we talked about the players, right, who can be participants in an open standard. We talked about the open standard process itself, and finally, let's talk a little bit about what is the final output, especially in terms of technology. What are the things that are actually produced by a standards body? So these are what I call is the specification triads, right? So the reason I call it a triad is because I put together this diagram. I used to do a talk on the JCP that's very, very similar. And what I found out is that these funny little triangles that shows out all over the place. These are triads of various kinds. So that's why I call it a triad, specification triads. So the three basic artifacts are specification documents describing what is the specification is about and what are its features. Then you need a compatibility test kit, something that is executable, right? Other than a document. You need something to be an executable set of tests that says, okay, if you have an implementation and you run these tests against it, that these tests should confirm that something is actually compatible. It meets the standard. And the specification document and compatibility test kit reinforce each other. Okay, and finally, you have compatible implementations. So somebody comes up with the end product that conforms to this standard, conforms to this specification. In some cases, you can have a mandated reference implementation. For example, in the JCP, everything is supposed to have a reference implementation, at least one implementation that is guaranteed to be in place, and it's always the same one. In case of Jakarta EE, you still need at least one implementation, but does not necessarily need to be the same one. Okay, so you in the Jakarta EE world, you can have multiple implementations as long as there's per standards there's at least one of those. Okay, we'll see how this works out in the end. This may become a situation where it's just a de facto reference implementation or not. Often that's what happens. That's why it's sometimes a good idea just to say, hey, this is a reference implementation. It's well understood by everyone. Now, this is another weakness of open standards. You can always have partial implementations, things that don't quite pass the compatibility test kit. This is why you need a governance regime and trademarks and a legal muscle behind open standards to avoid these things called partial implementations. Right? So this is just, again, very, very dangerous situation. And that's why I put the warning sign on my diagram. And finally, you need governance. Right, so it goes back to that review boxes, all those 3 or 4 review boxes after each of them. You need somebody overseeing all of this, making sure that, hey, things are not going wrong. Right, it's not that people don't have good intentions. It's just that it's difficult to guarantee anything if there's not an independent body overseeing and making sure that the best interests of the ecosystem are actually preserved at all points. You need stakeholders. Right, so you need at least a dominant part of the market participating in open standards for them to be successful, and then finally you need a community. You need a set of people interested in this and interested in the mind share. That's another true value of an open standard. If nobody cares about it, there's no community around it. Nobody sees its value. It won't be successful. So you need the community around that as well. So there's a debate around open standards versus open source, especially since the 1970s or so, certainly during the 1980s. There's been a debate that somehow open source replaces open standards and you don't need open standards anymore. The reality is very far from the truth, right? So open standards do provide things like transparency. They do not provide guarantees on much more the more important things that we all talked about, and hopefully by now you recognize. So there is no guaranteed TCK in open standards. There is no guaranteed transparency. There's no guaranteed interoperability. There's no guaranteed vendor neutrality. So it's false, right? So open source is not a replacement to open standards. However, it is an important complement. So if you really look, it makes a lot of sense for open standards and open source to be working together. And in fact, this is how it works in practice. Right? So for every single successful bit of software, most successful bits of software that stand the test of time, you'll find out that it is actually backed by one or more open standards. And open standards, in order for them to be successful, need to adopt open source. So the TCK needs to be open source. At least one implementation, the reference implementation, should be open source. And that's how you guarantee transparency, right? That at the end of the day, that's part of the fundamental reasons of why something needs to be an effective open standard. And there's no better way of guaranteeing transparency than open source. Open source is very, very good at that. Okay. So these are some of the usual complaints against open standards, and I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to breeze over some of this. So standards are slow. They're designed by committee, meaning you don't get to have your way. It's basically whoever shows up and is the most vocal that ultimately dictates the decision. Standards don't guarantee portability. Yeah, that's true. They cannot guarantee 100% portability. Don't have my feature that I value XYZ, right? Or my product has this feature XYZ that the standards doesn't have. Standards don't innovate. It's just a bunch of vendor experts and so on and so on and so on. There's a bunch of different complaints you can come up against open standards. So hopefully my view on this is relatively clear from this slide. Right. So nothing in the world is perfect, right? So you can take the best idea in the world and shoot a bunch of holes in it, right? But it doesn't mean that that idea doesn't have value. There's very little things that do not have downsides. The real question is it worth it, right? So these are some of the answers of some of the common ones that come up with that I see, at least, right? So standards are slow. Yes, that's very true. It's standard coming to consensus is slower than somebody just deciding to do whatever it is that they want without consulting anyone or talking to anyone or bothering to understand what the end user needs are. When you do these things, it takes time. Right? So reaching consensus takes time, and getting things right takes time. Right? So if you want to make mistakes, go very fast. If you want to do something right, you will probably take a little bit more time to do it, and you'll bring along your entire village with it. Right? Design by committee, yes, this can happen. Okay, it depends on, again, that openness, the desire and execution for openness. If it's not very open in practice, it can become designed by committee, but it's still better than a totally benevolent dictatorship where there is absolutely no possibility of anyone providing any input. They don't guarantee portability, that's true, but it's still no standard at the end of the day can guarantee 100% portability, right? That's virtually impossible. But it's still better than 100% lock-in, where you really don't have any such guarantees whatsoever. At any point in time, a standard will not have all the features, right? Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with something that is consensus-based. And either way, you don't want a standard to have the kitchen sink. You don't want it to be bloated or complex. It'll, at the end of the day, have a detrimental effect if a standard is complex or bloated. So you actually don't want all features in a standard. Standards don't innovate. That's actually not really true, right? And it hasn't been true. If you look at most standards, they do innovate in small ways, right? So whenever this is an engineering activity and people are working together to come up with something new, inevitably there is innovation. But what there isn't is adventurism. So you don't want a lot of innovation in open standards anyway. Okay, so you don't want to over-standardize unproven or niche ideas. Again, that devalues the fundamental value proposition of a standard. It needs to be a stable core, right? It can't be an unstable core that you cannot rely upon because there's always bad ideas that make it into the standard. And it's not just a bunch of vendor experts. It can be, if you, for example, as good as the ISO is, good luck as an average scientist getting attention from the ISO committee. You better be like some genius or have some really big organization behind you. Okay, but it hasn't been true for Java open standards in a long time, and that's something we should strive to maintain as well. So it shouldn't just be a bunch of vendor experts that define direction and do whatever they want. Right? The average Joe Schmo needs to be part of the equation here, and we need to make ourselves get ourselves in there, make sure that we are heard, make sure people understand that they need to reach back out to us, to us Joe Schmoes, to listen to what we have to say. Right? So at the end of the day, we can use the thing and we can advocate the thing. So all of this, hopefully, the subtext is we need you. right? So don't just go away. Don't just listen to my talk today and say, "Oh, nice talk, see you, bye bye," right? So at the end of the day, we need you to get involved, right? So if nothing else, you need to be vocal about keeping an eye on things and making sure that bad things don't happen. So Jakarta EE, in my opinion, is guaranteed. It has a lot of guarantees. The people that have formulated the work so far have come up with the process and the structure. They have all these things in mind. They understand, for the most part, what these things are about. So you should definitely get involved here. Right? This is a place where hopefully it's obvious that there is a network effect. If we don't do anything, what will emerge is probably at the end of the day a monopoly. So we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, and the end winner is this open standard. And there's no better way of guaranteeing that than you putting some skin in the game. So I already alluded to that dynamic of individual voices versus collective voices, right? And the importance of why collective voices matter. So in the Jakarta EE space, you are, I would say, very lucky that there is such a thing that exists already. And you can make yourself part of it, right? And that is the Jakarta EE ambassadors. Take a look at what we do and see if it makes sense for you. Now, finally, I want to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in my so far about 50-minute conversation. Standards are a great thing, don't get me wrong. Right? So we've already talked about why open standards need to be in place and why we all need to work hard to ensure that it succeeds. And it does not succeed on its own. It's kind of like democracy. If you don't care about it, ultimately it turns into fascism or something like that. That is no longer a democratic system. It looks democratic on the surface, but it's not. So you have to work hard in making sure open standards succeed and continue to succeed. But it can't be all a silver bullet to everything, right? So let's explore some of the reasons why that's not the case. So at any point in time, not everything should be standardized. So in particular, there should be extensions to the open standard that expand frontiers in unexpected ways, right? So because standards cannot innovate themselves, or shouldn't be, something else needs to innovate. And typically, the best way to do that is extensions based on proven open standards. And then standards can always adopt common, mature, and proven ideas, right, from these sets of ecosystems. And this is why you can't have open standards only. There needs to be other players besides open standards, where open standards are really the dominant player. We talked about before what it means to be a monopoly. Monopoly doesn't mean you own everything. It means that you're just important enough, right? So in this case, open standards can be just important enough and still allow for other players to innovate so that those can downstream turn into open standards. Standards can safeguard against monopolies, but one of the things that it does not safeguard against is oligopolies. So when there is an open standard, but there's too few people that control it, right? And this is again why users and user communities are important, right? So and why players outside of the open standards are sometimes important to serve as counterbalances against this oligarchy situation, right? So and oligarchies are not always malicious, right? They just kind of happen because there's a small set of players that work with each other very closely, and they're kind of buddies, and they don't want to sort of go against each other. So it's sort of complacent collusion, right? It's not something that these people are evil. It's just that they've come to be too comfortable with each other. Right? So this is another reason why you need sort of things like user communities and things outside the standard. And there can be peaceful coexistence, absolutely, right? So this is why you need these things and why they should be treated as a valuable part of the standards ecosystem, a very valuable extension of it. You need to basically value these things, but at the end of the day, don't value them too much, right? So at the end of the day, if you value them too much, they'll probably be then your next dictator. So you need to always maintain counterweights. But the important thing should always be open standards. But there needs to be an ecosystem around that as well, where innovation happens and competitive counterweights exist. At the end of the day, this is all about choice, right? It's a fundamental idea that you need a healthy amount of choices as a consumer. So those things need to be in place for you. But at the end of the day, if there's one message I would like to leave you with you this fine morning, at least morning for me so far, is you, the empowered user, right? So you ultimately decide all of this. You're in the driving seat. If you decide to be an empowered user, you can make all the difference in the world. If you just decide to do nothing and let somebody make all the decisions, well, you won't wind up with good outcomes. So this is why you need to be an empowered user and see the value in these things and get involved in them and hopefully articulate the value of these things to other people as well.
So Reza, I have a question from Sergey.
Yeah.
Can standards be changed? And if so, how often?
Standards should absolutely be changed. Standards, it's an important balance to maintain health and long-term maintainability in terms of a standard. So an open standard cannot be like a open source product. Right? Because there is a large ecosystem that depends on open standard and multiple people need to reach consensus and adopt the standard, it can't be so fast that nobody can keep up with it. Right? So it needs to be deliberately a little bit slower than its maximum velocity. Right, so I don't know what the right answer is in terms of Jakarta EE. My sense is no more than one release a year. Probably a release a year for Jakarta EE is a healthy enough pace. Anything more than that, I really suspect it's too much. Maybe the answer is that this quarterly non-LTS releases and really this one long-term support release for Jakarta EE. And in fact, I have the same opinion about Java SE as well. I believe the current pace that things are in is probably unsustainable. That's why you see a bunch of people just staying on Java SE 8. Any other questions? This is the end of my presentation either way, by the way.
Oh. So many people are just thanking and following the talk. Let me see. There is ask a question here. Okay, so I have from Martin Chavez. So in order to get transparency and have a truly impact on the market, it is recommended to use the judge standards, right? Open standards.
So yes, in order to guarantee transparency, you need those elements, right? You need people to be able to participate. In particular, I would say groups of users, Java user groups, absolutely. The Jakarta EE ambassadors is another way of participating as a group. You need to be able to have individuals that are able to participate, even if they don't want to be part of any other group. They themselves should be able to participate. Companies need to be able to participate in an equal fashion. You need that open process, open, well-defined process that lends itself to all of these things and lends itself to external review. You need important enough artifacts. So again, those the specification documents, the TCK, and the compatible implementations. So it's a bunch of different things that need to be in place that in order to make for all of this to happen. Absolutely.
Anything else from the audience? You're welcome, Martin. Okay, a lot of thanks. And just so you know, here on the Crowdcast, even, I know you know where to contact and how to contact Reza. You can always go to Jakarta EE Ambassadors. You can always also have a question posted here on this Crowdcast platform, and we can get back to you later. But I also want to reemphasize what Reza was communicating. We need you to get involved. And please feel free to approach us if you have any concerns in how to do that. And just a reminder for everyone that there is a big discussion going on between collaboration between Microprofile and Jakarta EE. We extended you the invite. Actually, Amelia from who is very, very involved in both of communities, but particularly Microprofile, extended invite to the whole Jakarta EE community. On Tuesdays, there are Microprofile hangouts where some of these topics will be discussed. So please participate and let's make open standards in Java EE strong and very much relevant. So I think that's everything from us. We're 2 minutes over time. Please look for another tech talk and any way to reach out and get involved. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Tanya. I appreciate your time, and hopefully this was useful.
Oh, very useful. Thank you so much, Reza. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and we'll be in touch. Bye.